And I'll kick off with the first question. And the first question relates to sustainable design. It's about which forms of sustainable inclusive design are most appropriate in Westminster in terms of building orientation, insulation, ventilation and layout. And I think we also need to look at the opposite of that. Some forms of sustainable design and perhaps some of the technologies that people may think are less relevant in Westminster's particular circumstances. Does anyone want to kick off with that question?
Just a point of clarification, is it passive design or inclusive design? Because your background talks about passive design. Is it, what's the difference?
Okay, I think we're looking at basically all forms of sustainable design. So we're not, although obviously the question here refers to inclusive design, which is obviously putting people at the heart of the design process. We are also looking at passive design, so in terms of the building orientation and insulation and ventilation as well.
Does this stage consider the building materials? I'm quite anxious that an awful lot of the materials that people are thinking of building with, metal, brick, concrete, they're hugely energy intensive, whereas things like timber are not.
Okay, thank you. All right. Are there any particular technologies that people think are quite inappropriate, either in particular areas of Westminster or for particular reasons?
Well, I think what I would regard as inappropriate is an immediate choice to go to redevelopment rather than looking at the potential for refurbishment, even if it's only reusing foundations and frame, because the embodied energy in existing buildings, which is just torn up, I know now sometimes the concrete can go down into aggregate, but there's a huge amount of our collective energy, will, and carbon has been used to create those buildings, and to automatically just raise them to the ground, let alone all the carbon and the energy and effort again in constructing a new building, is often a very wasteful process, even if the resulting building is a little bit more energy efficient in operational terms. But if you take all of those factors into account, it is still not a good thing to knock a building down which is capable of being refurbished to a higher standard. And I think that is often the better option.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, well, following on from that, so I know that this building is going to be vacated by Westminster, and I was working next door in Selborne House, and I believe both are due for demolition. I mean, what are the plans for redevelopment of these two sites? What are you able to tell us at the moment?
Not a lot, to be honest. Nothing really on specific buildings in terms of their...
But they are going to be, they are coming down, aren't they? They're not being refurbished.
I wasn't actually aware that a decision had been made on the council vacating, but perhaps I'm not in the loop. But I wasn't aware a final decision had been made.
Oh.
Hi, Jean-Pierre Vac, environmental consultant in Westminster. The tricky question is refurbishments and insulation. Given it's all conservation area, well, there's large parts of conservation area, how do you propose to breach two gaps? One in terms of listed buildings and conservation, and the other in terms of financial incentives to insulate external walls?
I guess we'd probably throw it back to you. Have you got any suggestions for us to take that forward? I mean, we're quite clear that there's a tension there quite often, but are there any suggestions for our policy approach to deal with those?
The financial question, it's from a planning perspective, it's really difficult to know what you can do. And I mean, the minimum legislation is Part L. And it doesn't require a full insulation to the external wall. So it's very difficult to know what we can do from a financial perspective. From a point of view of conservation, there are options to allow more dialogue between architects and developers and conservation officers to look at the possibility of insulating walls.
Okay. I mean, I think I'd add on the financial matter that a couple of nights ago we had the workshop that included planning obligations, and one of the questions at that workshop was relating to offsetting, so essentially setting a target that was higher than the building regulations, and where you couldn't achieve it, whether or not it would be mandatory or you'd have a choice. That was the matter for discussion, but that it would be offset, and perhaps what kind of tariff you might use, whether the mechanism was workable. So that's something that's already been raised at these workshops.
Okay, so if there's an offset fund, would it be possible to use the financial gains from the offset fund to fund insulation projects?
Okay. So essentially against retrofitting in other circumstances. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, is this on? Yeah, to go back to your original question about what technologies are appropriate or inappropriate, I think obviously there's a whole raft of measures that can be used. I get a sense that things like renewable energy sources tend to be one of the first things that people run to, maybe because they look more attractive. And I would think that there's an awful lot of work can be done with passive design, as touched on earlier, with do you need to redevelop? And then the issues of orientation. Are you making best use of sunlight or daylight or ventilation and thermal insulation? And I think there's a step process where you can get pretty big wins with pretty straightforward things. And I think that renewable technologies are on the way. Once we get to a position where we're looking for a very low carbon development, but I think because they tend to look glamorous and eye-catching and media-friendly, there's sometimes a tendency to start there, and I think that that's what brings you all the way down to lower carbon after you've exhausted all the other opportunities.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So definitely you would suggest that hierarchy of obviously looking at the sort of passive gains and energy efficiency gains first, and very much secondary looking at the renewables.
Ultimately, you're going to have to do all of it, I think, to meet the government's commitments on carbon. But certainly you've got to leave yourself somewhere to go.
Yeah. Okay, thank